Our next session is a wide-ranging conversation on the topic of customer-centric innovation in financial services and the technology and data architectures needed to deliver the next generation of financial services to savvy customers. And we have eminently qualified guests to speak on the topic. Chintan Mehta is the CIO and head of digital technology and innovation for Wells Fargo. He is also a member of the Wells Fargo Technology Executive Leadership Team. Chintan is responsible for building an effective and efficient digital ecosystem of experiences and capabilities which are safe, secure, resilient, and highly responsive. Chintan joined Wells Fargo in 2017 as the head of digital technology. He and his team played a critical role in accelerating the transformation and evolution of the digital experience for more than 70 million customers. Prior to that, Chintan was at Walgreens, where he was the group vice president and CTO responsible for product management, design, engineering, and operations across the retail, pharmacy, and healthcare businesses. He also held technology leadership positions with increasing levels of responsibility at American Express and Barclays Bank. BG, Bhaskar Ghosh, is the CTO of 8VC. He's had a distinguished career spanning over 20 years in tech leadership across diverse domains, including enterprise data and web infrastructure, digital advertising, social networks, and consumer fintech. VG was the VP of engineering at NerdWallet. Prior to that, as the head of data engineering at LinkedIn, he helped build teams and backends that helped fuel the company's meteoric growth. Earlier in your career, VG led engineering for the pioneering Yahoo Right Media display ad exchange. Speaking with Chintan and VG are Bill Cook, CEO of Yugabyte, and Karthik Ranganathan, co-founder and CTO of Yugabyte. Take it away, Bill.
Thanks, Sudha. Appreciate everyone joining us and welcome. Impressive pedigree here of people we have joining us today. So Chintan, BG, thanks. Karthik, good to see you. I'd like to kick it off by, really just talking about what we're trying to do here. Sudha, you mentioned it, that, as we think about driving innovation across the industry and large enterprises, it's not just about the technology, it's also the people dynamics and the organizational dynamics and driving towards business outcomes. All of that coming together in a collective thesis is super important. And we thought a talk about that, and obviously we're going to focus a bit on the technology itself and database specifically, given Yugabyte's perspective on this. But we think it'll be an interesting talk for all the participants. So thanks for joining. Chintan, I thought we'd kick this off really turning over to you and maybe talk, let's start up a level and looking at the financial industry. It seems like, a bunch of things happening, some fundamental shifts going on in the industry. You look at the Robinhood IPO and cryptocurrency and underpinning of security, we have a lot of things coming at you. So maybe your perspective as you think about it as from an industry perspective first, and then technology trends happening.
Yeah, happy to. So again, obviously, Chintan's opinion based on what I am seeing, so to speak. So I think there are two key underlying trends, at least the way we see it, or I see it. First is core banking itself, right? So I mean, if you, in a very simplistic sense, draw a line from what banking started off as 400 years ago or so, it was essentially at the core of it was, finding capital and finding the need of who needs that capital, sort of connecting those things. Sort of in some version of the story, it's the original platform play, so to speak, right? So it is like somebody has capital, they want to invest, and then there is somebody who has an idea and who needs capital and go do something. And then there are variations of it that showed up, right? There's a personal need, there's a company need, and so on and so forth. The basic premise that I would hypothesize and that I would propose is that is not undergoing a major shift that has stayed static for a reasonable amount of time. Where we see a lot of changes is essentially how these sort of interactions manifest, right? So there was all a sort of centrally controlled value stores or currencies being exchanged. Then it became a whole lot about different ways of underwriting that exact exchange. Then there was a better way of experience in that interaction, whether it's consumer interaction or anything else. And then now you have obviously cryptocurrencies or other forms of stored value and things like that. So I think the way to look at it, at least from my perspective, is that I think the core of the banking is starting to look slightly different. So the needs are evolving a little bit, very, very small, but evolving nonetheless. But the manifestations of it, where you see it on the consumer business, the kind of interactions you need to have, the kind of experiences you need to build, where you need to build those experiences, I think those are going a major shift, right? I'll stop talking after this, but if you take somebody who's relatively new to banking, or relatively sort of new to work in general, so kids, so to speak, or in college, they don't aspire to go to a bank. Forget for working, they don't get up in the morning going like, oh, I want to go to a bank, right? Most of these things are kind of a utility or a commodity play at the end of the day. So what is the safe and efficient way of giving them the banking services they need, but they don't know clearly yet? Right, so embedded banking, open banking, things of that sort. So I think that is going to become a big area of focus in terms of the experience layer of this whole ecosystem, which is, instead of banks owning the experience, it will be significantly more embedded in these different experience providers, along with newer capabilities on how you make it safe and efficient, how do you actually make it faster, real-time settlement, distributed ledgers, and so on and so forth. So I think it's, the surface expands like that, if you think of it that way, from my point of view. But I'll stop here.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then if you think about those changes that are occurring, and you think about the journey we've been on over the last couple of decades of the, digital transformation in its broadest sense, right? If you think about the data elements and infrastructure elements that are allowing you to think about the application development and the business opportunities in a different way, what are the things top of mind for you on tech innovation that's happening to enable that to occur?
Speed. I think it's usually a recurring theme. If anything, like if somebody were to ask me a question, what would you advise your 20-year younger self? I would be like, do things faster.
Yeah.
And I think that theme holds true, right? The customer feedback is very obvious about, like, change is imminent and it is obvious, but what is not clear is how quickly can we adapt to it. So I think from a pure technology lens, I think anything that we do which improves the throughput of the feedback time to the point we bring that back in front of the customer is definitely going to be fundamental, right? And there are a lot of technology stacks that play in this space, process changes that play in this space, skill sets, organizational structures which play in this space. But that's the main loop, the speed of how quickly can you go from ideation to production, then feedback back to production. I think that's critical.
And that obviously begs the question of getting over kind of a legacy and technical debt. Yes. So would you say innovation is going to trump, basically the idea of not changing, essentially?
Yeah, innovation is going to trump, and so is the ability to change fast, right? Again, goes back to the point. It's like you might have a bright idea, but if it takes you a long time to get it out, it's not going to make as much of an impact as you would expect. And more importantly, also, once you put something out there, the expectation, at least the precedence is being set in the market. Customers want to give you feedback and want you to react to it immediately.
Exactly.
Right? And that lag time between I told you something is, I don't like it, and I fixed it, is going to be very obvious. And that's going to be a big sort of factor towards how much engagement we can create, how much value we can generate.
Great. And BG, from your perspective, I mean, you have a front row seat watching these technology trends and investing in companies. What's top of mind for you from a technology trend perspective that you think is impacting Chintan and Wells?
I mean, we are seeing the usual by the way, thanks for having us, Bill and team. It's really wonderful. Nice to meet Chintan and listen to such an expert. I mean, the usual stuff that we always talk about in the context of digital transformation of large legacy high-time enterprises, going cloud first, data first, AI first, automation first, really importantly, API first. Look, all of them are happening, but I would say it is leading to a higher order theme of, I would say, application development being a really strong force. So what we are seeing in enterprises is, whether it's in healthcare or fintech or insurtech, is while automation of process is playing a huge role, and that's a core part of the 8BC thesis, what we're seeing is the emergence of a very large class of cloud native, AI native, data native, API native applications, which which sits front and center where what in the ecosystem Chintan mentioned, right? It's front and center in the agility theme, that essentially enterprises don't just want to become more efficient, they actually want to exploit the data assets and create business value out of it and be able to deploy them fast enough and create feedback loops fast enough. And so we are seeing this era coming up essentially as the era of what I called intelligent applications, which have to be developed quickly, deployed quickly, and feedback quickly. And that is driving secular changes in everything. Data infrastructure, that's front and center where Yugabyte would be sitting, that we'll of course talk about later in this talk. Becoming multi-cloud, cloud native, all of that stuff is going to happen below. And so we are super excited about, if I have to nail it down, the revolution that's happening is the app development revolution. That's one. The other interesting revolution that's happening tied to this is more personas are talking about data in the enterprise. It's going to be application developer persona, but also open source usage persona, as well as DevOps and cloud ops persona, as well as the budget holder persona. Budget holder personas we see as our portfolio companies go and sell into large enterprises. Earlier acquisition would be happening primarily from centralized IT. We're seeing a huge, fragment. We're seeing kind of empowerment and distribution of that. We're seeing now more personas saying, no, we have my local budget. I would like to build my data model. I'd like to build my application quickly. So I would say those two are secular changes we are seeing. Just to summarize very quickly, the emergence of cloud data, AI, API native applications becoming a central driving force of the upside of an enterprise. And second, more and more diverse personas who want to make use of data and AI.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, BG. And I do want to drill into that topic a little bit deeper, but before we transition to that, Karthik, beyond Yugabyte and the database tier, which we'll get to here in a second, things top of mind for you, technology trends that you're seeing in the industry that are interesting and shaping how we think about where the world's headed.
Yeah, I think I think both Chintan and BG pointed out very critical trends, and I'll maybe talk to it at one level lower. One of the things, and this is based a little bit on our experiences at Facebook, where we were building cloud native applications, and it was essentially what you mentioned, Chintan, is about how quickly can you build apps, how quickly can you incorporate the feedback loop, and sometimes, the way the nature of these application building things go, you never know which apps and which set of features help you hit critical mass and then really explode, right? So the success is always accidental, but along the way is littered with a lot of failures, right? So you build some apps that don't take off and, that don't evolve the way you expect, and you really have to bring it down, right? So if you really think about what's enabling this at this point in time, and why didn't we get here 5 years ago, 10 years ago, right? It really comes down to the fact that, early on, earlier in the development of technology in the industry, it took a lot longer to rack and stack machines and to actually open up data centers and to move data around. And therefore, that was always the leading, the thing that took the most time. So it's it takes you 8 to 9 months to get the thing ready, and you cannot react to it if there's accidental success. So, everybody is forced, including the consumers, to realize that, it will take them time to scale. They're doing really well, but we have to give them time, or it takes a while to roll out a service, right? Today, with the advent of the public cloud becoming stock, right, that's just a few minutes away, right? You can get way more machines at a way quicker time. So it's just literally 5 minutes or less, and you have however many machines you want in whatever regions you want, with operational data centers and, full security, everything ready. So the data centers themselves are kind of like as code, and you just roll it out in different regions and you're ready to go. So now the bottleneck naturally shifts to how quickly can you develop your applications and release it. Because if it takes 9 months to 1 year, you can do a lot, right? But if it takes 5 minutes, you can't do anything in 5 minutes. Practically, right? So you don't have to rethink the cycle to make sure that it accelerates. And this is an exciting phase, right? Because it's an exciting phase for consumers because they get so much value out of this, right? Everything improves so quickly, everything changes in real time. And as you see new asks that you unlock based on user behavior and paradigm, you react to it quicker. And so it's just much more seamless, right? If you even think about the rate of technology acceleration over the last 5 years, is way more than the 10 years before that, and so on, right? So ahead, what's exciting is exactly what BG said. Like, I think there's going to be a lot of data and data-driven decision making. There's going to be APIs because people want to consume it in a number of different ways, right? Like Chintan talked about an embedded experience, right? An embedded experience is really different ways to consume the core experience, but that means you have to base it on some core APIs so people can consume it the way they want and in the place they want, right? So that's going to be big. And the smart applications that BG mentioned, right? We absolutely saw this at even at a place like Facebook, like for example, where you want to keep the experience on the site really good, but then you get people, for example, that want to send a lot of messages and spam the site and do phishing and these type of things, right? You at some point at scale want software to detect that, and that is again a data-driven decision, and it has to be instant and reactive and high performance, right? So all of this is, I think, really exciting where it's all headed in all the core industries, right? Which is amazing.
So if we drill into this a bit, Chintan, you think about the experience at Wells, and obviously we have a bit of shared experience with Pivotal in the day and what we did with Cloud Foundry and this whole cloud native CI/CD pipelines and getting speed on the application side. Wells was certainly one of the leaders and champions and innovators driving that, as you know. And one of the theses here of why I essentially joined on with Kannan and Karthik was that the database tier, and specifically the transactional database, really lagged in kind of capabilities and keeping up with the agility you were building into the microservices app tier. But the counter to that is, you've got a bunch of databases out there, a whole range of them that you've deployed over the years, to Karthik's earlier point. And it was interesting, yesterday we had a similar talk like this, which you'll see with Logan from General Motors. And he was talking about how increasingly, and he's on the data side, but thinking about the data architecture first, right? And understanding scale of data and what's going to be required is going to be super critical for General Motors and really every large enterprises. So how do you think about the database tier, I guess, more broadly in light of what's going on in the app side, which we've just talked about?
Yeah. So I think the way I visualize that is we are probably connecting the dots looking backwards, obviously, on this one, which is to say that, like, we started out with, hey, I need data for doing certain things, and it's a transactional store, and it has to do certain things, and it has to do that well. A large chunk, not all of it, but a large chunk of our data storage and sort of retrieval stack evolved at the point where data by itself was not a first-class citizen in a lot of these conversations. It happened to be an orthogonal generation of that interaction, which I might offline analyze. What has changed, obviously, for us and for everybody else is like I will analyze it offline was like a few days out problem, meaning, oh, I can analyze it in 3 days, 4 days, 5 days, 6 days. That time window has squeezed, not necessarily by our own design, but just the reality of it is that it has squeezed pretty fast. So what ended up happening is I could do a fraud operation as an example to pick, which is a critical thing for us. And it could be like a 2-day, 3-day thing. But if I'm doing real-time funds availability on a check deposit with a picture which was just taken, how do I actually do a real-time fraud sort of detection in that ecosystem without waiting for 2 days, right? So now if you think from that business problem down, I think the database tier certainly then becomes like a first-class citizen that has to be addressed. And not just the database tier as in the technology, but the fact that your data is kind of scattered all over the place and you need to bring it together in some logical fashion where you can consume it, process it, react to it, right? And there are a lot of players in this space evolving from that starting point, which is to say that, hey, let's bring all the data together, right? So the erstwhile data warehouses, data lakes of some kind and all that, which all started being an OLAP type platform, which is like, okay, you're doing transactions, you have an RDBMS or some sort of a data store, which is for transactions, but then offload it here, and then we'll do some analytics. But the more you fast forward this storyline, what you'll find is that sort of the time window is continuing to squish. It's not like it's sort of static, right? So the more you have to hop out from the primary place where this data lives to some other place where you have to go do something with it, we will have a problem. So then that brings back to the question that you're asking is, hey, how do we see the database tier? I see the database tier kind of collapsing in the two traditionally segregated spaces, which is OLTP and OLAP, right? So transaction processing and analytical processing, which were kind of treated as two separate class of problems, are going to, from at least timing function, become part of one sort of, I need to do it and I do need to do it now, right? Now, when you put it as one sort of, it happens to be right now, this time window, you have to do both these things. Even if they are two separate classes of problems, there are multiple solutions to it. One, you could come up with a Uber unified stack, which can do all of it, right? Which is one way of thinking about it. The other one is you actually do a parallel sort of execution where you can say, hey, I will do it for both intentions and I'll do it at the same time, which is another way of looking at it. And then there are hybrids of these, right? So, but these are the two extreme poles of this. So I do think, back to your question for Wells, I think that macro trend is not going away, right? We call it many different things. We sort of have all these intermediary processes where, you know, you have to deal with organizational support structures, what sort of, you know, currency you have to maintain, vulnerabilities, and all those processes kick in. But at the end of the day, that sort of trend isn't going away. So the way I see it is, the more we can bring solutions which kind of keep that trend in mind, where we can say, hey, data will have to be used and processed in parallel, sort of both for eventual use as well as immediate use, right? Because it's not an apt analogy, but the simplistic version of this is like all the relational data structures, or as well as even sort of the other document oriented structures and everything, evolved in the world where the idea was immediate consistency. I will use it right now and I will sort of do something with it. And then maybe I'll offline sort of correlate and do some other things. So when you bring those things together, the data stack, the data technologies have to evolve in that sort of case where it can do both of those, or it at least has the ability to fork it out and do both of those at the same time. As a class of problems, just to be very clear. You know, there are a lot of competing choices in this space. You guys are obviously playing in this space, right? Thinking about it in that sense, but that's how at least I see the problem.
That's great. And, you know, I heard you mention in a previous talk that I watched, you were talking about distributed ledger-based ecosystem, smart contracts, real-time money movement, payments, that, you know, these things are going to be super important and important to your customers, right? And where Wells is thinking about how you deal with, you know, process, regulation, speed that you mentioned earlier. And I'm just curious how, you know, maybe the use cases you're thinking about that apply to the transactional side of the database where Yugabyte's focused at Wells. What are the things that are top of mind for you where, you know, it's kind of the most important problems to go focus on or use cases?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, there are examples, those examples that you picked, they're very relevant, but not for the nature of the technology underpinning it, but basically the problem statement that we are trying to deal with there, which is to say that, hey, today, there is an accepted norm on the lag between I want to move money to Bill and it will reach Bill at some point time T after I did that, right? And if you, again, go back to my previous comment I made, which is like, hey, the expectation is it's going to be immediate, right? Today, we have a solution in place for that, something like Zelle, and there are other parallel solutions to that, which sort of do it in that sort of immediate fashion. But then there are some hurdles to that, right? The hurdles you have to clear, which don't necessarily show up in that scenario, are things around what if it's an international money movement, right? How do you do foreign asset control? How do you do anti-money laundering? How do you do sort of basic risk capabilities, which you would expect if you're doing a larger amount, right? Because smaller amounts, not very high risk as a unit, are sort of kind of solvable. But then you keep layering in all these additional things you have to do in that context in the middle of that transaction. So then, you know, you have to buy time or you have to squeeze it and make it faster. So that is the biggest problem for us, real-time payments as an example, right? Because at the end of the day, just in a very simplistic sense, thinking from a pure consumer bank perspective, not adding any other of those businesses, 3 transactions are bread and butter, right? Customers come see their balances, they do some digging around. So the account summary, account details, and all forms of payments, bill payment, check deposit, money movement. You solve for these 3 in terms of real-time settlement, being able to sort of minimize the basis points that go into fraud, right? And so then you can give higher limits, you can give immediate funds availability, you do minimize after processing. Those are all good stories, both for value from a customer standpoint as well as from economics, right? So the more post-processing we have to do to make the experience look like it's fast, the more we do fraud write-offs, the more we do sort of additional overheads behind the scenes to sort of make sure that we are not screwing something up along the way. right? So yeah, those use cases, again, thematically goes back to like customers' expectation is that it's my money, I'm moving it to Bill, and I want it to go today. Why do you in the middle come and tell me these 10, 15 different things? And we're doing it for the right reasons, but it's not necessarily making it additional value from an experience standpoint. So how do you sort of take that friction out of the play? And technology is one of the biggest enablers for that, right? So to Bhaskar's point around AI, like obviously good solution there instead of manual interventions. Bunch of sort of data gathering and sort of spreading capabilities where you can go to multiple different places with the same data set, same canonical truth that you can react to it is also essential. Yeah.
Okay. And Karthik, when you hear Chintan speak about those use cases and the requirements, what goes through your head as you think about the database, distributed SQL database like Yugabyte? What are the key attributes you think we need to serve up, if you will, to meet those requirements?
Yeah, so the first thing I think of is transactional consistency of data, right? Like you should be able to express, the ability to move money or any other transaction in a way where it's it has strong guarantees irrespective of what happens underneath, right? Like failures, et cetera, et cetera. Different operations probably require different types of guarantees, right? And the ability to encapsulate those and give a wide, rich number of those, right? Like different isolation levels, different strengths of replication guarantees, et cetera. That becomes very important, I think, first and foremost. I think the second thing, obviously, table stakes is the fact that the system is always available, right? Like, so you can actually go and do this anytime you want. I think the only thing worse than a slow transaction is a system that's down that cannot do the transaction. So that's obviously, I mean, I'm just mentioning it, but it's actually hard to ensure, transactional consistency with high availability, but it's taken as table stakes right now, right? The other things that become interesting and important, right? Like Chintan mentioned, international transactions, right? Like now you're talking about moving data overseas where one person necessarily is far away. And so the user experience of how quickly he's able to read, the other person's able to absorb the data, get the result of the transaction, to view the transaction, the same basic operations that Chintan mentioned, view the balance, view what's going on, dig around, etc. That becomes extremely important from a usability point of view, right? It has to have a low latency way of serving data. Now, traditionally, you'd build this into the application architecture, but that again increases the loop of how quickly you can bring the solution to the market. So pushing down more and more ways of replicating, partitioning, moving data around different geographies starts getting very important and very interesting. And not to mention, it's not just user experience. Many times it's also the regulatory nature of this, this space, right? Like many countries tell you to keep the data local for their citizens or people living in their countries and so on and so forth, right? So that brings an interesting challenge as well. And finally, it's remarkable to see how quickly people's behavior shifts to some of these new things when they're available, right? Like, for example, COVID happened and everybody went online, right? It's like the number of people that went to banks or grocery stores just dropped overnight. And I guess as users and consumers, we don't quite pause to think about it, but as service providers and people building, like if you just think about the enormous strain on the internet fabric, right? Or banking, for example, and mobile banking and all of that, or like grocers and delivery and so on. It just puts an enormous amount of pressure and scale, and the requirements of all of these above requirements need to be met, but at enormously large scales, and that change overnight, right? So the ability to keep up with that also becomes quite interesting, I think. So these are the essential attributes of a digital world, right, in some sense, and about digital transformation. These are what we think about at Yugabyte DB also, but I think they apply broadly, not just to the database tier, to the application tier as well, but you need all pieces to do this, right? So.
And maybe BG, you're listening to this from the, a customer-centric view, thinking about technology, obviously from a partner point of view. You've got a front row seat watching all of it. What goes through your head as you listen to this, that either is a focus area or things top of mind that you think we need to keep front and center?
Chintan, I'll just follow up on a couple of comments Chintan made. One of the interesting things he said is there is source of truth system record data scattered all over. So Chintan talked about three things at least. One is about merging of OLTP and OLAP, which is what we have been trying to do for 25 years and still haven't succeeded. But if Chintan buys me some beer, we can talk about it over a whole evening. It's, even though it's an interesting topic, I'll pick on something else he said. He said something really important that we're hearing from many large time industries that one should not expect system of record databases to be all unified. Source of truth data will continue to be scattered all over the enterprise as companies buy other companies, and even data democracy inherently creates fragmentation. And it's a fool's errand to say, I must unify everything into the same format and keep it there. So what is going to continue to happen is there will be different schema, different format, different kinds of databases, which are all sources of truth, which will continue to grow. And Wells Fargo would want to write applications which has a near real-time view of all of this data. This is what us old database people used to call the federation problem. So back in the day, I'm sure Bill also remembers this from his time at Pivotal and Greenplum, and we are seeing the data federation needs appear very strongly in the OLAP offline space, and that's why a tier like Presto has become hugely popular, right? It's essentially a data federation play, right? Giving you this unified view. The even more interesting is what we have found is as people application programmers are trying to write more online applications, OLTP applications using RESTful APIs, they're like, man, it's really hard to program against REST. And I want something declarative, but I also want view of data all over the place. That's why the GraphQL revolution has started, right? Essentially, GraphQL allows you to do things simply in a declarative way by saying what I need, not how you find it for me, number one. And GraphQL also allows you access to data which is sitting in many stores, in a Postgres database, in a Mongo, coming in from a Stripe or PayPal API. Fair enough. And we see this federation question that Chintan mentioned as a huge driver. And we see the GraphQL revolution as a key component in enabling those applications. And GraphQL will not survive without an amazing data tier below it. You will need like a mid-tier application server. Sorry, I'm speaking in more tech speak, but you need like a next generation BA WebLogic application server, but then you will need a data tier. And that's where, if you look at the GraphQL revolution, a lot of them are building on top of Postgres. It just accidentally happened that way. It turns out that Karthik and Kannan made the decision of using kind of classical Postgres compatible compilers on top. So they made an amazing design decision that they can probably be this de facto source of truth, SQL tier below GraphQL. So I didn't personally, being a database practitioner way before I became a VC, I didn't anticipate that all the stuff we tried to do in federation, which mostly didn't work back in the day, right? From our Oracle and IBM background, has now come back into the offline space, sitting on top of blob stores and relational database warehouses. Now it's beginning to happen in a major way for online applications, which are actually active, right? You actually want to be able to like trigger stuff. To me, that's hugely exciting. And I think that's how I interpret Chintan's comment around data scattered all over. In terms of real-time feedback loops, there's a lot of components to it. I will just point out two things. I think of three things as playing out in data. You need pipes, you need stores, and you need automation, and you need workflows. So what we see is that processes which are human in the loop are getting automated more and more and more and more. And pipes are now transporting sources of truth data, log data all over. And essentially, you will need a data tier which should synchronize everything globally while taking care of local privacy regulations, all of that stuff, compliance, right? So the real-time thing, that is the second comment Chintan made around real-time feedback loops. We are seeing the need for this grow exponentially. So essentially what's happening is data, near real-time data, all kinds of data, process the budget you spent on them earlier used to be looked upon as downside budget, cost. We are seeing everything around data and automation becoming an upside budget now, that you will actually won't survive if you don't invest in it, right? So as venture capitalists who are kind of sitting on the sidelines, writing checks and then clapping, this is super helpful for us, and as a practitioner from my past life, I'm pretty blown away at revolutions like GraphQL and in real-time data. In terms of merging of OLAP and OLTP, Chintan will have to buy me significant quantities of beer, and we can.
That's a different discussion. And maybe Karthik, if you just want to comment on where BG and Chintan were going there on as you think about GraphQL and other interfaces, et cetera, and just talk about the way you think about that.
Yeah, we're actually seeing this happen in the market today, right? Like it's all about like again speed and simplicity for developers. So the easier it becomes for developers, the sooner you can get features to market, your agility and speed increases. I think all of these technologies like GraphQL, like Spring, like all of these web frameworks, all of these things, they just serve one purpose, which is to stop repetitive code, boilerplate stuff, like things that you have to do repeatedly over and over, but eventually tend to become complex, both to build and to operational and to operate, right? They just take it all away and make things much faster, right? Giving you all of that agility. All of these technologies may not be spanning and serving every single use case, but if they're able to do a good chunk of it, that still gives the enterprise a huge amount of agility, and that's what they're attacking, right? And they're doing that really well. Now, all of them tend to pick data. They all need data stores, right? All of this requires data stores because most applications tend to be stateful. So they tend to pick what is the best out there at this point in time, right? That's really how, because they're also revolutions that are basing their future on, a hypothesis, right? And it has to get proved out. And so, for example, if you look at GraphQL, it is getting proved out, it is getting legs, but it didn't start that way. It had to start small. And so they would pick the database that is the most flexible and the most capable in order to power this application, right? And that just happened to be Postgres, the most open source, available, and feature-rich database out there. And they said, why don't we just make that a standard? And it's not any one GraphQL project or vendor, it's a majority of them that have doubled down on Postgres. Right? And it's not by accident, because that was the database that was growing the fastest, and for a reason. So exactly as BG said, the decision to reuse the upper half of Postgres was conscious, because on the database side, when we are ushering in a revolution, the first barrier to entry, the reason why we would not succeed is if it's difficult for developers to build applications. So if it slows down the very thing we're building the database for, which is, hey, this is a new database, I need to understand it. It'll take me 2 years. 2 years is an enormous amount of time today compared to what it was 10 years ago, right? So the reason we did that is to really make it a seamless migration, to really make sure all of these new frameworks simply work, right? And the amount of work you need to do to get that last mile of ROI from the cloud is really simplified, right? So that's really the perspective that I have to.
And before we switch gears here, I want to move off of technology and talk about the other aspects of this journey. Chintan, any closing comments when you listen to all of this from a technology perspective?
I was going to say, I will buy Bhaskar a beer just because I think I brought back pain from the past based on the statement I made. But let me clarify. So when I said converge OLTP, OLAP, I was not talking about one physical place where both of those happen. I was
thank you for that, by the way.
Convergence from a time window standpoint.
Yeah. Exactly.
So no, I agree with that, by the way, honestly, right? So I think the need statement I would requalify, and then we can close this topic here, is that it's essentially, we are saying the same sort of a thing. Maybe we're just framing it in a different way, which is developer speed is paramount here because they are the ones who are building the application, and you want to take something which is the closest or adjacent what they are currently used to, right? So that choice about using Postgres as a interface QL or for that matter GraphQL as it becomes more prevalent, I think makes perfect sense. But again, going back to Bhaskar, your point, and I do owe you a beer, but the sort of the timing function of it, right? So which is to say that, hey, look, I do need to be able to do a transaction processing, which is actually immediately consistent, right? So I'm not going to blow away cap theorem right here, right now. However, I do need that sort of thing immediately, but I also want to analyze it. But I also want it available everywhere. I also want it sort of, so that additional adjacencies that keep cropping up, which is like, I could do this and be okay with it, but then now I need to do this one more thing, then I need to do this one more thing. That is where I think the trajectory of this thing has to go.
That's great. That's great. And so as we transition here and talk more about the people and leadership side, you mentioned at the beginning speed. Speed was both the objective and the challenge, if you will, of how things are going. How do you deal with that? How do you overcome that challenge? Like, what kinds of things do you do as a leader?
Yeah, well, I don't know. We're trying to. I don't know if you've succeeded. But no, so I think what you do though, so I think I'll break it down into 2 or 3 buckets, right? I think from just a mental model or a skill standpoint, right, for people who are working in this area or any of these areas for that matter, is
Right.
the ability to recheck their current point of view on what that problem statement looks like, right? I think we make a lot of mistakes. We have some amazing deep technical talent all over the place in the industry as a whole, not just in Wells, for example, but we do have a propensity to sort of replay the same playbook we have played in the past, right? So how do you sort of break that as a leadership group, or as a some way of giving that ability to go reset, like, don't assume the answer, reevaluate the problem a little bit. I think that needs to be a conscious, intentional sort of a thing where you dither intentionally, you push that a little bit, right? So that is one part of it. The second one is you do bring in people. I think again goes back to the skill, is you do bring in people who have a degree of naivety, which kind of does not bring in a sort of, again, sort of a perspective which is kind of mirrored in what they might have done in the past, right? So bring in some orthogonal skill set and things like that. So that is one dimension of it. The other one is, and this is the journey where I don't know if there is any sort of like, oh, we are done and we are happy with this one, is and I think Karthik made this point, which is like, most of these things that we do are driven by a hypothesis, right? At best, in a long-term trajectory, you are better than random at success, but in some cases you're not even at that, right? So then the sort of the leadership function in this area is to minimize cost and time to learn, right? That is how I'll tie it back to the speed component, which is, it's not necessarily about how fast can you do features, how fast can you get feedback in. It is also about how fast can you know that this is not something you want to do. And that is where we spend a lot of time and focus on at Wells Fargo, given our history, right? We have made, publicly, we made mistakes. But more importantly, right, how does that sort of underpinning process, the underpinning sort of technology itself, the way the people, the way they operate, the way they think, how do you keep molding it towards that ability to say, hey, look, just think of it as a function of, it is okay to fail, but do it quickly. Don't make a life support system out of some one idea which went into production somewhere somehow, right? Because that's one of the bigger problems with large companies, which is and the right, I don't know what is the right way to frame it, but one of the ways to frame it is like, it is somebody's baby which went into production, right? And it never comes out, right? Partly because somebody's year end or whatever is tied to it, and we create a life support system around it, and then you keep perpetuating it, right? So then if you can actually minimize the emotional toil of like removing something, either through technology or through just the leadership coverage that people get as a cultural backdrop, I think that is critical. So that is how I think about it. That's how we think about it. And we're not going to get everything right. It's just unlikely, statistically impossible. We are also not going to get everything right in terms of the market fit. We're also not going to get everything right in terms of technology choices, right? Because we're going to find that we made a choice and then we do something and we realize that, hey, that was a bad choice. So, but then in all these things, the underpinning pieces, like how fast can you pivot? How fast can you course correct?
Yeah, I heard you mention in one of your talks about having the right leaders and having the right mentors were important to you, and you specifically mentioned Charlie and Saul as mentors at Wells. And if you think about the judgment and the leadership they've provided, that's essential to drive change and take risks that ultimately succeed. How would you describe that? What is that like at Wells? What would be your lesson for either your leaders at Wells or others in other enterprises?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, again, yeah, I think the basic physics of it is don't be shy of running into a wall. When you run into a wall, test that whether that wall should be there. And then the net outcome is, if the wall is still there, you have intentionality. So I think it boils down to the intentionality of why something was a blocker or was a hurdle, and does that hurdle still require to be there, right? Whether it's a regulatory hurdle or a legal hurdle or compliance hurdle. And I think this is true for every industry, every company, which is like, there are reasons why these were in place, which impede speed. So the hurdles in this case, the way to think of it is they impede your speed. And they were put in place for a reason, but is that reason still valid? And if the reason is invalid, what's your way of like going past it, right? And to me, that sort of mental ability to, hey, anybody can challenge, but everybody should also be aware of why we are doing what we are doing is like the fundamental piece, which I think Saul, Charlie, and the rest of the OC, I mean, for that matter, have been very vocal about, very visibly doing, which is what is needed, right, for a company to turn around.
Great. And then if we look at it from the other side, from someone like Yugabyte, being a VC-backed company, an emerging company, what would be your advice to us as an emerging company helping drive big change within Wells?
I would say not this specific conversation, but the conversations around, hey, look, we see this in the industry, right? Speed as a more meta or an abstract construct rather than like, hey, and I understand that there is a little bit of like, we want to get a product out there and product use, right? I completely understand that. But I think where a lot of help is needed for everybody in this industry is essentially where you can give a more higher level meta feedback around, look, this is what the change is. It's not about new banking offerings. It's not about new products. I mean, it is to some extent, but they are not by themselves standalone. They are a function of what is happening as a general trend. And I think Karthik did an amazing job of tying it back to like, okay, well, what does that mean? Like if you peel back the layers and if you keep going down the stack, like what does it finally mean to your data store and the way you interface with it? Right? I mean, it boils down to a choice at that point over there, and then connecting it back. I think that storytelling will help, right? Not everybody is in the same degree of depth or sophistication. And the more we can talk about it collectively, the easier it is for people who are making choices on, day in and day out on like an application developer who says, am I going to store it here or I'm going to store it there? They don't think about this, not because they don't want to, it's just that it's too far away removed from their current problem set, right? So.
And BG, from your side, obviously you've sat on both sides of this, at LinkedIn and Yahoo, and now on the other side, I almost hate to ask this for your advice for a company like ours, because I get it all the time. But more broadly, not specifically Yugabyte, but more broadly, as you think about emerging companies working with large enterprises, what do you see and hear as best practices or what not to do?
Look, I mean, obviously we believe in kind of pioneering tech companies, and we believe in people who can solve really hard problems because they need to be solved. I think, I mean, there are many kinds of startups, so I wouldn't bucket them all into the same kind of, I'll just, in the context of large enterprises, which require pretty serious infrastructure and data that cannot fail. I mean, companies like Wells Fargo, Bank of America, Goldman Sachs, they are not messing around, right? I mean, their applications have to really work. I mean, they can't have like, I think in those, we believe in companies doing deep tech like Yugabyte and, many of our other portfolio companies where the inherent technology problem they're solving is actually incredibly hard. So there are certain startups which are not in that bucket where you can go to launch very quickly, iterate, fail fast, all of that stuff. When you're building source of truth databases, I'm sorry, like stuff has to work. So I can, Yugabyte falls into that bucket, but it's also one of the things we believe very strongly about quality of software is from the open source feedback loop. So I would say one of the big things from 8VC is we are noticing that infrastructure change is happening inside the enterprise, but open source software is almost like de facto level 0. If that software is not open source, the risk remediation on the buyer side is that narrative often falls apart. So I would say those are some of the tips. Building source of truth databases is hard, but when you have a product that has been open sourced, citizen programmers are using it, and they are giving, and the network effect of quality of software is a big thing. So we look for those things in certain classes of startups, and I'd say a company like Yugabyte or a company which wants to build the backend of GraphQL, right? I'm just giving some examples. A company which builds the next generation API platform for financial services, or we have a company called Nihilus which is building an API infrastructure which is sitting on top of your email, your mailbox and your calendar. Well, you can't make mistakes there. Fair enough. So I think open source is a big thing that we are noticing a call for from the acquiring side. And 8VC and I, we are like hugely on board with that. But we are pretty thoughtful about what class of software you're you're shipping. And I think there are a bunch of modalities there, but I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, BG. Chintan, we've talked about technology and we've talked about leadership attributes. Obviously, a core element of all of this is getting the right people and skills in the organization and the right culture. Maybe if you could speak to that, like as you interview people that want to join Wells, what are the key attributes you look for in people that you hire?
Yeah, I mean, the table stakes, so to speak, or the hygiene factor is obviously depth in tech and the ability to sort of be malleable as you understand the context and the problem. The other one, at least, which is very contextual for Wells Fargo, is the one way of looking at what we are trying to do from a transformation standpoint is it's a company which is 170 years old. It has legacy, right? I mean, you can't walk in with an assumption that, hey, nothing over here is older than 5 years, right? I mean, 5 years is new in many cases over here. So there is a certain degree of mental and a mental fortitude, so to speak, that you'll need when you come in saying, look, I start going deeper into the sort of the flow, the more impedance, the more older, the more legacy systems I'm going to hit. Now, you can't on a turn of a dime, right, throw away systems which are older than I am, and I'm a pretty old guy, right? So how do you sort of work in that land where you still want to do the right things by the customer, which by corollary could extend to doing new things from a technology standpoint potentially, but then still integrate it back with a 100-year or a 50-year or a 60-year-old sort of system, which has been sort of built bespoke in many cases, ground up, and those kind of things. So we look for those kind of like people who are comfortable solving that class of engineering problems, which is it is hard. Partly it is hard not because just because the technology is kind of not that prevalent, but it's also the sort of approaches you have to take to make those things work from an experience standpoint while abstracting away that complexity behind it. And so that's a very, very, very hard learned skill. Like you don't get that, at least in my opinion, without having been punched around a few times in a different scenario. So like Bhaskar's reaction to me saying one database for everything, that's reminiscent of that. Absolutely, right? Like you tried to do something and it didn't work out. You have the scars to show that, but we're looking for those people.
Great. And Karthik, on your side of it, obviously we've gone through explosive growth of hiring people here at Yugabyte. What do you look for as key attributes of people joining a company like Yugabyte?
Yeah, I think the key attributes, I mean, there's a few of them. I think the first thing is the innate curiosity and the hunger to learn, right? That's I mean, we don't believe in just people that are an expert in a field. It's also people that have the curiosity and want to learn. And sometimes fresh thinking, it really helps a lot. A little bit of self-driven attitude, because in a fast-growing company, right, like you cannot wait around to be told what to do. You have to like yell, jump, do something and get heard and unblock yourself and make sure you have an impact. So the innate need to have an impact, the innate need to do something, I think that's going to be extremely important. Yugabyte tends to be a very extremely transparent type of organization. So, that they should be, I mean, some people find it a little too transparent perhaps. And so, we kind of look for people who can kind of play in that spirit, right? Like, and, give credit where credit is due, be completely open about failures. I think Chintan, you mentioned, we kind of create this ecosystem, right? Like we're completely okay with people failing and trying to accomplish what they did, as if they're real reasons and real learnings, they'd be rewarded for it, right? So this is the level of transparency we would expect, where, it's being fearless about, look, we really tried this, we gave it a shot, but here's the outcome. This is something that's just stupid to do or should not be done, or it'll actually take a longer time. And those are like really worthy learnings, right? So I just put some of those traits on top.
Thanks, Karthik. Appreciate it. So as we wrap up here, any closing thoughts? I can see BG's getting pulled to dinner here in London, so we'll wrap up here. Chintan, kind of final thoughts for the audience as you think about everything we covered here this morning?
No, I mean, look, I think Karthik said it, BG said it as well. It's exciting, right? These problems have been solved in some ways, in some cases, in some partial sense, but they are hard to solve. And that is what makes it cognitively interesting, right? And I think we'll have to keep at it because the shape of the problem also changes as we evolve. So yeah, this is going to be fun.
Awesome. Looking forward to it. BG, closing comment?
Pleasure participating. I would say the single thought I'll leave you guys with is, data-driven applications are going to be king. But from a venture capital point of view, there are two stories there. One is legacy migrating applications. One is a new class of applications. Venture capital tends to work when at least the second category is really large. And why we are excited is at this point in time, we see the need for digital transformation transforming the old category, but that's not all. There's a massive category of new applications coming, and those are going to happen really quickly. And we are excited to back Yugabyte because we feel it can do both. It can be the source of truth tier for the massive new class being created, as well as being so solid and compatible that it can support the application migration as well. So I'll just leave that, the kind of application
Awesome.
is king, old and new.
Yeah, great, thanks. And I'll speak on behalf of Karthik. Thank you both for joining this. I think it was a great talk, and hopefully the audience appreciates it as well. Thanks for your time. Have a great day. See you, everyone.